Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. If I may ask you to take your seats. I'm Frank SESNO. I am the director of the School of Media and Public Affairs here at the George Washington University. See, we have our SMPA fans in the audience, and I'm delighted to see that. And I'd like to welcome you to Lisner Auditorium and to the George Washington University. We are very proud to co-host this event here this evening. It's going to be a fascinating and stimulating conversation, an important one with people who know the world and people who know journalism and the role that journalism can and should play in informing an electorate that should be involved in our civic life. We are collaborating with the News Literacy Project. And this project is phenomenally important because when we talk about news literacy, how do we teach young people in high school, in college, beyond, where their information should come from, what information to trust, where the facts are, where the information is, where the facts pick up and the opinion leaves off? How are they going to be engaged and involved in our society if they are not news literate? We all know we're all awash in information, billions of websites, endless social media. But there are those who do this for a living, and with Alan Miller and the News Literacy Project, they are going into schools, into classrooms, and engaging young people, and teaching young people where to go for their information, how to tell good information from bad information, and how to take that information and engage with the society around them. So it is a great pleasure and privilege and very important to have this group here on stage this evening. At the School of Media and Public Affairs, we are home to about 400 students. Do I have School of Media and Public Affairs students in the room? All right. We have two programs. We have journalism and mass communication, and we have this thing called political communication. Now, that is not an oxymoron. You can communicate politically. I've seen it happen. Occasionally, you can even do some good in the process. And we engage our students in figuring out where and how the information comes from, how it can be conveyed with credibility and conviction, and the important role that it plays in our society and our culture. This event marks the beginning of what I hope will be a deep collaboration of our school with the News Literacy Project. Their mission, and they state it right up front, and I'll quote, is to give students the critical thinking skills to become smarter and more frequent consumers of credible information. Imagine that, if we were all more frequent consumers of credible information. We might not have had a government shutdown here. That would have been if all of us had been more frequent consumers of credible information. I'd like to introduce the founder and the intellectual and creative force behind the News Literacy Project. He is a distinguished journalist himself. He is a man of deep conviction. He is now committed to marrying this credible information, this vital source, to our young people, to working with them and with journalists in schools, to have people appreciate not only how important information is, but how engaging, how stimulating, how creative it can be, and how it can empower people by connecting them to their world. Alan Miller was a reporter with the Los Angeles Times for 21 years. He was 14 years a member of its very high-profile investigative team. He left in 2008 to establish this project. Over the course of his career, Alan received more than a dozen national reporting honors, and in 2003, he was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for National Reporting. He brings his conviction to the sanctity of information, to the importance of investigative journalism, to the crucial role that accountability plays in our culture, to the teaching and to the mission that he has launched. And so it's with great pleasure that I introduce to you Alan Miller of the News Literacy Project.
Thank you very much. That was great. Good evening. Thanks to Frank for that extremely gracious introduction, and thanks to all of you for being here with us this evening. I also want to thank Frank and the GW School of Media and Public Affairs for hosting us this evening. We are proud to partner with them as well. And also our panelists, GWEN IFILL, Tom Friedman, and Andrea Mitchell, for so graciously taking time out of their extremely demanding schedules to be here with us this evening. I want to also share our gratitude with Qualcomm and the Washington Post for serving as our lead sponsors, which allows us to offer this event to you free of charge. Before we get to the main event, I want to tell you a little bit more about the News Literacy Project, though Frank got us off to a very good start. We work with teachers and seasoned journalists to give students the critical thinking skills to know what to believe in a digital world, how to discern credible, verified information from raw information, opinion, misinformation, and propaganda. We also want to give them an appreciation for the kind of quality journalism that organizations like PBS, the New York Times, ABC News, and the Washington Post produce every day. Ultimately, our goal is to give young people the tools to be better students today and better informed citizens tomorrow. We do this working in English, history, government, and journalism classes in a variety of ways. We have a flexible classroom course, an ambitious after-school program, a compact one-week digital unit, and we do workshops with students and professional development with teachers. We're now in our 6th year, and we're growing rapidly using digital tools. We're excited about our digital unit, which retains the voice of the journalist through narrated videos led by prominent reporters, correspondents, and editors, and a live webinar. This is our primary path to growing the program exponentially. We've also launched a new website just last month with 3 features: a Learn channel with narrated video lessons by journalists and other experts, a Teachable Moments blog, and a showcase for the superb student multimedia projects that they are doing in our program. We hope you'll have an opportunity to check it out at www.thenewsliteracyproject.org, and that you will like us on Facebook and follow us at the News LP on Twitter. We are very well aligned with the new Common Core standards that 45 states in the district have adopted, which means we are now swimming with an increasingly powerful educational current. Already in our first 5 years, we've worked with more than 100 teachers in 60 diverse and dynamic schools in New York City, Chicago, and the Washington, D.C. region to reach more than 10,000 students. And our journalist fellows have done more than 400 presentations. With the new digital tools, our numbers are now rising dramatically to meet increasingly growing demand. Our goal is to see news literacy embedded in the fabric of American education, both in the classroom and online. In fact, at a recent conference of the American Society of News Editors, U.S. Education Secretary Arne Duncan said this of those who are teaching news literacy: "The work you are doing to help the next generation become more sophisticated in understanding the news is absolutely vital. To have full power over their lives, young people must understand the world they live in. They have to read, they have to follow the news, and they have to vote." So, if you care about public education, the future of quality journalism, and the health of the nation's democracy, we hope that you will consider making a tax-deductible contribution to support our ability not only to do events like this free of charge, but more important, to support our core mission of expanding locally and nationally to reach far more students. I'm particularly pleased to announce that any contribution you make this evening or between now and December 6th will be fully matched by a grant from the Sun-Times Foundation in Chicago. You can donate on the information table on your way out. You can pick up a donation card and envelope, or you can break off the back of your program guide where you can leave us your name and email if you'd like to be on our newsletter list and to get information about future projects like this, or to make a contribution. With that, I'm now going to bring out our panel, starting with Tom Friedman, the foreign affairs columnist with the New York Times and a best-selling author, Andrea Mitchell, chief foreign affairs correspondent for NBC News and host of MSNBCs Andrea Mitchell Reports, and GWEN IFILL, our moderator and co-anchor of the PBS News Hour, co-anchor of PBS News Hour, moderator of Washington Week. Please give them a warm round of applause.
Thank you, Alan, and thank you all for coming out on this nice, toasty, cold night.
This is fantastic.
We are very happy to see you. I have to tell you a few little housekeeping issues before we get started. One is that Michael Gerson, who was advertised as being here tonight, couldn't join us tonight, health issues. He's fine, but he couldn't make it, and he's sorry not to be with you tonight. And the other thing is, at some point, we're going to chat among ourselves, and then there's going to be a microphone in the middle aisle, or I guess I see them on the two side aisles, for you to take questions. We're looking forward to your questions as well, because I know they agree with me that this is the way we get to learn things. Now here's the secret, the dirty little secret about tonight. Andrea and Tom and I really go way back. I covered the White House with Tom at the New York Times, and I covered politics with Andrea at NBC News. So the truth is, they taught me everything I know.
Hardly.
Certainly about this issue. So I'm going to have so much fun here with them tonight, and you guys get to eavesdrop on it. That's the best part. And then we get to eavesdrop on you. So I want to start. There's so much to talk about on this topic. When we first started talking about this conversation, we were like, let's talk about foreign policy. Yeah, okay, fine. Little did we know. Little did we know how much would pass between a couple months ago when we said we'd do this to tonight when it turns out that that's the page one story every single day. And it's kind of exciting, actually, to every day be based in Washington and try to explain to people why this sort of thing matters. You're about to hear from two people. Nobody does it better. This morning in the New York Times, Tom Friedman actually very thoughtfully wrote a column about what I wanted to start tonight by talking about, which is Iran.
We aim to please.
He didn't call and ask, he just did it. And that shows you how close we still are. So Tom, as I watched these talks, which have been stopping and starting in Geneva, finger pointing coming out about whether, in fact, there's a deal, there's not a deal, who broke up the deal. Why should the U.S. be in the middle of this at all? What is our interest?
Well, we have several layers of interest, I would say, Gwen. First of all, we still have, I believe, over 100,000 young American men and women serving in Afghanistan. And people don't really know the history, but when we went into Afghanistan in 2001 and ousted the Taliban government, Iran played a critical role in helping us. And Iran, being a Shiite country, is opposed to the Sunni fundamentalist Taliban. So we have an overlapping interest. In fact, I was in Iran shortly after that. And in fact, Javad Zarif, who was then deputy foreign minister, I did a column back then, and it must have been late 2001, from Tehran, and either quoted him by name or as a senior Iranian official, saying how deeply distressed they were that the United States not only never gave them credit for the role that they played in helping oust the Taliban and keep them ousted, but of course they got hit with being part of the axis of evil right after that. Right. And so we have a big interest there. No country has a bigger influence over the future of Iraq today, no outside country than Iran. So if you're thinking about how we stabilize Afghanistan when we leave, and hopefully leave something that doesn't collapse, and if you're thinking about how we bring stability to Iraq, if you're thinking about how we could possibly get a peace agreement in Syria, if you're thinking about how we influence Israelis and Palestinians at the margin to come to a peace agreement, if you're thinking about all these issues, it's really hard for the United States to make any headway as long as we are locked in what is now a 34-year-old Cold War between the United States and Iran. So nothing has really done more to destabilize that region than that Cold War. I would also say that there's something deeply unnatural about the antipathy between the United States and Iran in that, on the evening of 9/11, there was one Middle East country that held spontaneous candlelight vigils in memory of those killed at the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. It was a country called Iran. So there's one thing that the Iranian people never blamed us for. They never blamed us for their leaders. In the Arab world, you had just the opposite. People blamed us for their leaders, and therefore many people applauded 9/11. And so this is a country where women are in government. They are empowered. There is real politics. It is not a democracy in any true sense of the word, but there are elections. It's somewhere in between. So if there were a way to begin to unwind this 34-year-old civil war, we have a fundamental interest in that, over and above, and certainly in addition to the whole nuclear question. And so the point I was trying to make this morning is when people, say to us, well, this is, the Israelis or the Saudis or the UAE, they have the veto over this. To which I say, excuse me, we're not here as your lawyer. We're also not here to cut a bad deal. And by the way, the deal we hope to cut is one that will serve your interests as our allies as well. But we sometimes, lately in this administration in particular, has gotten very diffident about, we're just trying to help, We have 100,000 young men and women in Afghanistan. We don't need to apologize for anyone to be part of this story.
Andrea, last time you and Tom and I were in the same room together was in New York during the UN General Assembly, and we were there as a group of reporters who were being wooed by the new president of Iran. And I wonder whether the democratic elections, or the kind of democratic elections that Tom referred to, whether that has now changed things, that leaving Ahmadinejad behind and trading him in for Rouhani has made a difference in where these kinds of talks are leading.
I think arguably there is no way that these kind of negotiations would have become engaged except for Rouhani and principally Zarif, whom Tom just mentioned, who had been the ambassador to the United Nations, who is been given the nuclear account. Now, up until now, or recently, the Supreme Leader, who still has the veto power over any agreement, had repeatedly rejected what underlings had negotiated. I was in Geneva in 2009 when we thought we had a deal to export enriched uranium from the so-called Tehran reactor to Russia, and it would be cleaned, and then they would get back the nuclear fuel for the medical reactor once it was reprocessed. And that deal, everyone was, declaring hallelujah, and the negotiators went back to Tehran, and I know from Zarif, when he was at the UN, the Supreme Leader said, I never gave you the authority to do that. You've exceeded your brief. So this is a completely new situation, which is not to say that there isn't a charm offensive and that there still aren't the Revolutionary Guard, which controls not only military but economic interests and is just waiting to pounce, which is why John Kerry and others believe that there is a very small window and that they need to strike while they can. And that is what is encouraging some in the region who think they have veto power to suggest that he is too eager. Now, he said today to us on the Hill, we're not going to do a bad bargain. He has said, we're not stupid, we know what we're doing. But the reason why he is so undercut is that he was undercut by the White House on Syria. John Kerry came out on the Friday of Labor Day weekend and gave a speech at 12:30 in the afternoon, we're going to war. We all carried it live.
We recall.
And at 5 o'clock, the president did a walk around the South grounds with his chief of staff, Dennis McDonough. and said, you know, I'm not so sure, should we go to Congress? When 4 congressional leaders, all 4 had said, please don't ask us, because we do not want fingerprints on this. Go do it. Do not come to Congress. They then convened at 7 o'clock a national security meeting without the Secretary of either Defense or State, and came to the conclusion that they would, after not having really discussed this substantively all week in nonstop meetings, that they would go to Congress, and then informed at 9 o'clock at night, informed the Secretary of State. So you have a Secretary of State who is engaged in Middle East, you know, Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, who is the lead on Iran, who is trying to get the Syrian opposition and the Russians and all the rest to Geneva on Syria. You have Iran, as Tom has so ably pointed out, as the fulcrum of all of this. The rearming of Assad across Iraq from Iran, the destabilization of Iraq from Iran. Netanyahu is correct, Hezbollah's influence.
Ah, but you just mentioned the name for the first time, Netanyahu.
Exactly.
He whose name won't be spoken with the veto power. How much power does he have to derail all of this?
Well, he has a lot of power domestically with Congress in both Democratic and Republican camps, and that's the buzzsaw that Kerry ran into in the Banking Committee today. And that's why he's going to be going on television and trying to make a public case of why this is good for America. It's a very hard argument to make. And the reason why Netanyahu and the UAE and principally the Saudis and others say that they are suspicious is they don't trust this administration on Syria because of what they see as the retreat from military action once it was signaled. They see the undercutting of the Egyptian military as well. I mean, they have an argument to make about inconstant policy from the administration. And while agreeing with Tom that they shouldn't have veto power and that this policy can be defended on its merits for American and international global interests, they are not wrong in saying that there has been a lot of mixed signals coming from the White House.
But Tom, is Netanyahu playing an internal domestic game or a global game in this? Or no game at all, I guess?
I'm going to answer that. Remember, let me just pick up on one thing that Andrea said in response to your question, and because I think you have to go back to why was Rouhani in New York when we saw him.
Right.
And he was there because the sanctions have worked. And in fairness to Israel, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, we would not be here had they not stiffened those, insisted all along that the sanctions be stiffened. And so I think one has to acknowledge that. And Netanyahu played an important role in that, as did the Saudis and others. I mean, as did President Obama and his Treasury Department, who organized all these. But the sanctions worked. Iran's currency has been cut in half. Imagine how people here would feel if our currency had been cut in half. So Iran is really hurting, number one. And then the signal of that was, so Iran just had an election a couple months ago, and the Ayatollahs allowed 6 men to run. They were called Mr. Black, Mr. Black, Mr. Black, Mr. Black, Mr. Black, Mr. Light Black. Okay? Mr. Light Black was Rouhani. 51% of Iranians vote for Mr. Light Black. That was a big signal to the supreme leader that we are hurting, and we're not sitting for this forever. And so he had to move, and I think that's very important. I think one of the things that the Israelis have to really think through here is, let's go back to the Syria vote that Andrea referred to. All that happened so quickly, and so many other things were happening with the shutdown and healthcare.gov, that we didn't fully absorb the impact of what just happened. What happened was that a foreign government used poison gas to kill 1,000 men, women, and children in contravention of a red line drawn by the President of the United States. And the U.S. Congress, we never held a vote, but we wouldn't have needed to, was going to vote not to do anything about it.
It was going to blink.
It was going to blink. Now, I think we need to unpack that for a second. That was a very important moment, because it relates now to the Iran story. So what was going on there? Well, in my view, what was going, I was just in London last weekend and was talking to British officials. They were just asking about the mood in America. And the point I made to them was, ladies and gentlemen, the Middle East finally wore us out. Just finally wore us out. After 9/11 and Iraq and Afghanistan and Arab Spring coming and going and Oslo coming and going, we're just fed up. And we probably have a big role to play in some of these things failing, certainly Iraq and Afghanistan. But people are just tired of it. And you put that together with fracking, and you have a situation where the Middle East goes from a necessity for us to a hobby. I like hobbies. I'd like to build model airplanes sometimes. But some days I work on my hobbies, and some days I don't. And that really is what the Congress was saying.
Does Israel know that?
Well, I think this is what I think the Israelis have to understand, and this just to pick up on Andrea's point. So let's say that, and by the way, there are many deep reasons to doubt the Iranian sincerity. You don't have to be Netanyahu to be worried about this. And I don't begrudge anyone their skepticism. But let's just think about this for a second, is what I'd say to them. Let's say you scuttle this deal by getting the Congress basically not to go along with the president. By the way, that would be a pretty bizarre thing as that gets played out. That the U.S. Congress, led by Democrat, does not supports a foreign leader's interpretation here over the American president. Then the result of that is that there can be no diplomacy. That means the only option is a military option. But we just saw the American people say, we don't want to do a military option in Syria. Do you think the American people are going to sign up for one in Iran? I certainly don't. So then you're left with the Israelis having to do this alone. Well, okay, they have the ability to do it once, maybe. But then the Iranians will have perfect breakout excuse. The sanctions will completely collapse. Are the Israelis going to keep bombing Iran? So it looks to me like they have not thought this through, okay? I don't see the end game here.
And in fact, the Israelis say that they have the military option, and we've always felt that they did, because we've seen what they did with the Korean-built reactor in Syria. We've seen what they did before in Iraq. But the bottom line is that the Israelis, as long as these negotiations are going on internationally, do not have a military option. Unless they are responding to an attack. They do not have an option right now against Iran as long as this is going on, just politically, in terms of the reality. It's an interesting full circle for me, just in terms of my career, because one of my first assignments here for NBC was Camp David. And today, the CIA declassified a lot of the background material, and Jimmy Carter had at the Carter Library a whole seminar on what intelligence he had on Sadat and Begin, the personality profiles, because he wanted to know how they would react to stress. And, it's 150
did your
pages.
Name appear in it anywhere?
Fortunately not.
I'm just saying.
I was not important enough back then as a junior reporter. But when you think about the weariness that America has about the Middle East, just when I think about standing on the roof of the Hay Adams Hotel next to John Chancellor, and in that spring in March of 1979, watching the Accords signed on that antique table on the North Lawn, and then again September 1993, the handshake on the South Lawn with Bill Clinton getting Arafat and Rabin to shake hands. The excitement, this is of course before the Second Intifada and everything else that we experienced. So you think of the possibilities that existed, and I give John Kerry great credit for trying to re-engage, because it really wasn't engaged in the last 4 years. But one parenthetical note here, which gets back to what happened on Syria, which is the centralization in the White House of foreign policy to the likes we have not really seen since Henry Kissinger was National Security Advisor and Secretary of State. The fact that Tom's colleague, Mark Landler, and other colleagues wrote a story a couple of weeks ago about Susan Rice's Middle East policy review done internally at the White House without involvement by the Secretary of State or any other agency heads or the Secretary of Defense to decide what the Middle East policies should be, what should be the priorities, and to say explicitly on the record that we are disengaging.
Well, let me use this as an opportunity to talk about John Kerry. How's he doing?
He's everywhere. It's relentless. The rule of thumb now among those of us who often travel with him is pack for, if they tell you the trip is a week, pack for 2 weeks. There have been too many people trying to figure out how to dress for television or newspaper interviews when he just leaves and doesn't come back. He is absolutely engaged, and engaged in a very substantive way. But Tom has memorably covered this far longer than I. The likelihood, I think, of an Israeli-Palestinian agreement when Netanyahu is so focused on Iran, is so angry about Iran, and is now going to punish the United States by not being as flexible as he might otherwise be, I think, on the Palestinian front. And when you have such weak leaders in all camps, it's hard to fathom. So there's Syria, which is becoming increasingly likely that we're going to live with the status quo of Assad. And I think presidents have to realize that as commander-in-chief, you can't just say Assad must go and expect that that will magically happen. That undercuts your authority.
Tom?
I admire what he's doing because in contrast, I think, with some of his predecessors, he's daring to fail.
He's what?
He's daring to fail.
Exactly.
To make a journalism point, when I became the foreign affairs columnist for the Times in January 1995, I got a postcard from Tom Wicker, who was one of my predecessors, a great domestic columnist for the Times in the 60s and 70s, and all it said was, "Don't afraid to be wrong, otherwise you'll never be right."
That is so brilliant.
And you'll never be ahead of the pack. And I admire Kerry for daring to fail. I covered Secretary of State Baker. I was on all 15 trips he made to the Middle East before the Madrid Peace Conference. 14 of them ended with me writing some variation of a lead that said, "Secretary of State James A. Baker III failed again." Okay. And on trip 15, when he succeeded, he came to the back of the plane. He said, "Friedman." Okay.
I could just hear him saying
Okay, you can. So I admire that. I think what is part accident, was not part of the grand scheme initially, is, though, that the Secretary is actually teeing up simultaneously peace or negotiations on the two most neuralgic issues for Israel, which is Israeli-Palestinian and Iran. And I think both are going to reach a point where there will be real choices on the table. And so, and legitimate choices that Israel is going to have to make. And so, for Netanyahu, there is going to be a moment of truth here. A cynic would say what he's doing, basically, in sort of trying to counter Obama on Iran and basically present him as feckless and a bad negotiator, is create an excuse that the Americans don't have our back. That will be an out for the Israeli-Palestinian. That may be an overly cynical interpretation. He has, as I said, there are legitimate questions about how far you set Iran back, how much time, etc. And so I think we have to give Israel its due on that. They do live in the neighborhood. They have been threatened by this country. But at the same time, it strikes me as sitting here, they have not thought this through.
Is it possible, however, that, I mean, it's a big world, and is it possible that John Kerry and by proxy Barack Obama and the United States is going to spend all of our time stuck in those two neuralgic negotiations?
Well,
take its eye off the ball.
I mean, I did a column earlier after he took over. Kerry became Secretary of State, in which I may have said this in a talk and not in a column, I don't remember, but he had been to Israel, Palestine, Jordan, you know, a dozen times, and he'd never visited Mexico. And that isn't just a small thing, because, you know, we now live in an age where countries will compete by platform. So there's the EU platform. There's the Greater China platform. We are the North America platform. How we integrate North America in terms of immigration, economy, technology, is going to be hugely important. We have a neighbor to our south, Mexico, that's going through an amazing transformation with an amazing young president. Actually, you know, doing reforms that we never contemplated before that any Mexican president could get through. And you would never know that from the discussion in this country. You know, Mexico is this weird combination today of No Country for Old Men and Social Network. You know, I mean, everything you've heard about Mexico is true: guns, drugs, cartels, everything. But there is a huge high-tech engineering boom there that has Mexico exporting Chryslers to China. That's not easy.
And some of this has come onto the president and Kerry's plate. I mean, they didn't ask for Egypt to explode this way, and they're trying to disentangle themselves as much as they can. They've got Afghanistan and the withdrawal and the election coming up and the babysitting of Karzai, the constant threat of terrorism, what we saw coming out of Yemen. I mean, there are so many things in this region they can't seem to get themselves out of it. The aftermath of Libya, which is clearly not going well. And Syria, a civil war that is,
you know, Gwen, also, one thing I learned, just to your question, Andrea, about, you know, Kerry and Obama, is that one thing I learned, because I covered Baker all 4 years, Baker and Bush, is that a Secretary of State is only as effective as his partnership or her partnership with the president. If foreign leaders think, when they sit down across the table from you as a Secretary of State, they are talking to the president, they sit up a little straighter.
How do you
if they think that talking to you is downtime on their day, kind of sit down.
You know, let me give you an example, a perfect example of that. I was with Colin Powell on his first meeting with Sharon. And I was waiting in Sharon's backyard with the rest of the press corps while he was in the meeting, and then they were going to come out and talk to us. And my cell rang, and it was our White House correspondent saying, President Bush has just come into the Rose Garden and announced a new Middle East policy.
Yeah.
Which is not the policy that Colin Powell was presenting to Sharon. Well, who would Sharon call when he needed something done in the year or two that followed?
He never recovered from that.
It was never the Secretary of State. And that is the kind of undercutting. Or also, Colin Powell, in March of 2001, when the South Korean leader had come to the White House, come to the Oval Office, and was supporting the Sunshine Policy and the re-engagement with the North, which had been negotiated under Clinton. And Clinton had said, you know, at the end of his 2 terms, he had, in December of 2000, a choice to make. Was he going to go to Camp David and try to do a Middle East peace deal, or was he going to follow up on Madeleine Albright, the October visit to Pyongyang that I was on with her, and take up North Korea's offer to normalize relations? And he figured, well, since South Korea is on board on this, George W. Bush will not be able to walk away from the way we've teed up North Korea. But if there's a chance, so he called Arafat and said, are you really ready to make a deal? And Arafat said yes, without, of course, having circled back to Mubarak and the other Middle East leaders, so not having the authority to really make a deal or to feel that he could make a deal. So they spent all that time in Camp David, cut short the trip to Japan, all the other things that happened. We were going through, you know, Bush v. Gore, so there was lack of stability. So it was very hard for the president to imagine going to North Korea at that moment, and the moment was lost. So then March comes about, and the South Korean leader comes, and he's in the Oval Office. And Powell had to go out to the driveway and tell the reporters that the policy he had outlined of engagement with North Korea had been vetoed by the president.
It's no longer operative.
It's no longer operative.
Yeah.
So you have an undercutting of a Secretary of State. That is not happening now.
That was my next question. How do you assess whether...
I think John Kerry
or is it
does
too
have the
soon?
presidency here, but I do think that this White House is very insular. That Hillary Clinton, for all of her celebrity and her success, or the perception of success, never really had the entree. They were, at the leaders' level, she and the president, I think, got along very well. But the rest of the foreign policy team, which was populated with a lot of campaign veterans, never really got past
The principals got along, but the staff never got over it.
Right. So she figured out what she could do, and she stayed within those parameters. But this secretary is, as Tom has correctly said, not afraid to fail, does not have ambitions to run for president again, is not trying to keep his copybook clean. He is putting everything on the line. He's risking it all, and the president seems to be letting him try.
Tom, whatever happened to the Asia pivot? Speaking of the rest of the world.
Syria?
Well, the Asia pivot was a victim of the government shutdown because it's hard to have a pivot if the president can't go there. And President Obama has canceled 3 trips to Indonesia.
It's 3.
And yeah, in his presidency now. And of course, the last one was for the APEC summit. I was just in Singapore 10 days ago and 2 weeks ago. And
are you keeping track of this, by the way? He was in London last week.
Yeah, that's right.
Singapore. And tomorrow, I won't even
I don't
tell
know how
you.
he does it.
And that's all people there were talking about. You know,
Really?
how Xi Jinping, the Chinese leader, came. I believe it was Xi Jinping. It may have been Li Ka-shing, the premier, I'm not sure. But whatever, the Chinese were well represented. And of course, John Kerry was there, but the American president wasn't.
Note that Tom is not traveling on John Kerry's plane.
No.
Which is the worst single experience
Yeah.
for any reporter can
He
have.
knows when he's coming home.
Been there, done that. Well, I would say that I think these things like pivots and whatnot are overrated in terms of grand strategy. It means a lot to the Asians, though, that we show up, that we be there, that we appear as a counterweight to Chinese influence. But ultimately, you know, a pivot only has meaning if we have a healthy, vibrant, growing economy. And we can put 2,000 Marines on the coast of Australia, and I don't think that 1.3 billion Chinese, you know, are quaking over that. You know, I mean, I don't think it got them to redo their grand strategy. So I really think the real pivot is what happens here in terms of getting our own house in order and being an example that others want to follow. I think that's the biggest foreign policy issue in the world.
And we don't really have a policy. You can pivot, but you have to have a coherent policy toward China, and I don't think that has evolved.
Let me ask you all to reach back in your memories of the things you've covered and the places you've been and the presidents you've known and give a sense, especially to the future budding skeptical journalists out here, about what you've learned that has, for instance, you mentioned just now that in talking about the Asia pivot, you talked about the American economy. Sometimes people think of foreign policy and domestic policy as completely separate things, and it's completely clear it's not. That when Netanyahu can get Bob Menendez on the phone, that can ruin the president's foreign policy day. So how did you learn along the way to integrate that in your coverage especially?
I would say Tom has done this better than anyone else writing about foreign policy and economics, because in his books and his columns, he has fully integrated the economic implications of technological change, of globalization, and of its impact on foreign policy.
Yeah, I mean, I really, you know, thank you, Andrea. I appreciate that. So life for me is one big mashup, basically. I've written a book on the Arab-Israeli conflict. I wrote a book on globalization. Then I wrote a book, Alexis Naltri, wrote a book on
You wrote about
technology.
5 books on globalization.
The world is flat. Then I wrote a book on environment and climate change, and then I wrote a book on America. That used to be us. So I just finished doing a documentary on the Arab Spring, on the environmental stresses that caused the Arab Spring. So it's going to be on Showtime in February. And so it took me to Yemen and Syria and Egypt, looking at the Arab Spring through a completely different, lens. And so when I'm like covering, the Arab world, I'm not just thinking about the generals taking over. I'm thinking about how you're going to create jobs. Why are the people here in the streets? How did we get to a world where wealth got concentrated at the top, but power got dispersed at the bottom? So these are all technological, political, economic interactions. And
it matters whether you're covering Venezuela or whether you're covering North Korea.
Yeah, absolutely. And I bring all of those to any story I'm covering, and
or fracking.
Or fracking, whatever. It's all part of it. And we, I really think as a journalist, I've always said, one of my mottos as a journalist, Gwen, is come empty, leave empty. If I just come and sit down to interview Andrea and I say, what's new? She'll give me a commodity quote. The latest thing on the top of her head. She just filed her story. As a journalist, if I come to her and say, Andrea, I think the Middle East is going downhill because the combination of how climate change is coming in here and doing that, she may give me the greatest compliment any interview subject I think can give you as a journalist. I've never said this before, but then you don't have a commodity answer. And so I really believe you got to come with a point of view. So my point of view on the Middle East right now, in Egypt, is that the Arab world's been governed by actually, I'll give you a better example of how I arbitrage all of these things together. So I've been doing this documentary on climate change, and we actually begin the documentary in Salina, Kansas, because part of the story is how the drought in Russia, wildfires in Russia, drought in China, and floods in Australia in 2010 combined to wipe out the surplus in the global wheat market. And because 8 of the top 10 wheat importers are Arab countries, and Egypt being number 1, this affected bread prices, and it's one reason that the chant in Tahrir Square was bread, freedom, and dignity. So we shoot in a bakery in Egypt, and then we go to Salina, Kansas to visit a wheat farm. Now, the wheat farm is run by a guy named Wes Jackson, who is a MacArthur Genius Award winner. And Wes Jackson is a very well-known bioscientist who has one goal in life, and that is to develop a perennial form of wheat that could be grown without tilling and could grow naturally in the vegetation of the prairie. So Wes was basically giving me a history lesson, actually a bioscience lesson on the prairie. And he explained to me that the prairie was a polyculture that was naturally resilient. It naturally fertilized itself and pesticides and was enormously resilient. And what we did as foreigners and then as farmers, we came in and we wiped out the polyculture prairie and we planted monoculture crops, wheat, soy, sorghum, etc. Monocultures are enormously susceptible to disease, and they require enormous amounts of high-density fossil fuels, tractors, pesticide, fertilizer. So he's explaining all of this to me.
He's lost us.
No. I'm going to take it back to you in a second. He's explaining all of this to me, and all I'm thinking of, and I finally just stood up, and I said, Wes, that's really... Oh, by the way, he also made a very important point. When the Dust Bowl came, the prairie survived, but all the crops died because it was naturally resilient. So I said, Wes, isn't that really interesting? Al-Qaeda is using high-density fossil fuels from Arab oil states, donations and charities, to wipe out the polyculture of the Arab Muslim world in order to impose a monoculture to purify the Arabian Peninsula. And when was the Arab Muslim world at its strongest, at its height? Between the 8th and 13th centuries, when it was this incredible polyculture. I then extended that in a later column about why covering the Middle East had prepared me for covering the shutdown in Washington, D.C., to point out that the Tea Party was using high-density fossil fuels in the form of donations from the Koch brothers and other oil interests to wipe out the polyculture of the Republican Party.
You've got to watch Showtime.
All right. And replace it with a monoculture. And remember, the Republican Party was an amazing polyculture. Teddy Roosevelt gave us national parks. Okay? Richard Nixon gave us the EPA, the Clean Air Act, and the Clean Water Act. George Bush the Elder gave us cap and trade to deal with acid rain. Ronald Reagan gave us radical arms control. Monocultures are enormously susceptible to diseased ideas. And so you can arbitrage these things in interesting ways, and it gives you, Gwen, from a journalistic point of view, if you pull it off, it's authentic and not just a gimmick, gives you a perspective nobody else has.
And let me give you a little example. Very micro
Then we want to take some questions from
example. Mid-90s, I'm in Taiwan, pre-positioned to cover the live fire exercises across the Taiwan Strait. So it's a mile between the southern China province and Taiwan. And our fleet, we had carrier groups going in. I mean, this was the last big conflict between Taiwan and the mainland. And I'm trying to figure out a way to explain the proximity and the interdependency of the Taiwanese economy and the Chinese mainland economy, which was a very big, integrated, high-tech, coordinated economy. And so I decided, being a child of the 60s, that Quemoy and Matsu were the key to understanding this. The two islands that had become, you know, the subject of the debates in 1960 between Kennedy and Nixon. So we went to Quemoy and found a fishing village where the Taiwanese fishermen didn't fish. They would go a half-mile out across the strait and meet the mainland Chinese fishermen halfway across every day and exchange money for the catch, because there were so many more mainland fishermen, there was no way that the Taiwanese could compete. So all the fish that was getting to market in Taiwan was really fished by the mainland. And this constant flow was just this wonderful and very visual microcosm of how people were getting along while the fleet was approaching and they were getting ready for live fire exercises and everyone was saying we were going to war. And that was my best way of explaining that there wasn't going to be a war. And that sort of television, as your documentary shows, is a complicated way of trying to illustrate stories, but there is no definition between economics and foreign policy. If the sanctions hadn't worked, the Iranians wouldn't be at the table. You know, there are so many relationships here that tell you that you have to understand an entire society to understand what leaders are going to do.
Perfect answers. First question from our audience here.
Good evening. My name is Darrell Balknight. I'm a junior at Gonzaga College High School here in D.C., and I attended the News Literacy Project's workshop over the summer. And my question for you is, what challenges and opportunities do you see in informing the public about global events in the digital age?
Well, I can just say that this is an enormous challenge and an enormous opportunity. We, in my company, know that people are not home at 6:30 or 7 o'clock watching television. And they're not, you know, strapped to their seats or sitting around the table the way we were growing up watching Cronkite or the Huntley-Brinkley Report when television news began. So it's all digital. It's all about finding new platforms. And you're going to be, I hope, watching my newscast on your phone or on some other way. And young people are not wedded to the evening newscast, but well, I hope that you're all seeing and reading and experiencing it online. So the digital age is truly transformative, and we just have to find ways of doing it not only technologically, but of making it palatable and interesting and lively and not superficial.
Can I ask you, how do you consume your news?
Different ways. I read newspapers. I know a lot of kids don't.
You actually read a Dead Tree newspaper?
Yeah, I do.
Okay, that makes one of you.
Yeah, so newspapers or media sources online. A lot of stuff comes in through Twitter, obviously, so social media plays a big part in it as well.
How about you, Tom? How do you consume your news?
You don't want to know. I'm really old-fashioned, so I'm not on Twitter. I'm not on Facebook. I read the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Financial Times, the Economist. I look at Politico and Huffington Post. I read the Haaretz every day, Beirut Daily Star. I like my news edited and filtered, and
how much are you reading online, and how much?
I do read. Unfortunately, my wife reads the paper, the full paper, and she briefs me on all the things I missed. She's sitting right here. But I do read the paper. All the papers online now, including mine.
He's married to a brilliant woman. Thank you for your question.
Good evening. My name's Abra Ahmed. I'm a senior at Walt Whitman High School, and I heard about the News Literacy Project through my government class. Many from my generation feel that we get a more objective understanding of politics and foreign policy from late-night comedy hour rather than the 7 o'clock evening news. PBS aside, Jon Stewart and Bill Maher may have more credibility with my generation than many journalists from the mainstream press. My question, did the press lose its credibility by failing the American public during the Iraq invasion, and are you falling into a similar trap in Syria by emphasizing the chemical weapons story rather than the real issue of how to hold Assad accountable?
I'm going to let them handle the questions about Iraq and Syria, but let me handle the question about Jon Stewart. Here's the thing. You can't laugh at Jon Stewart's jokes unless you have the information. Right. And guess who Jon Stewart watches to get the information? Guess who he reads? Us. In the end, and I used that line on Stephen Colbert a couple weeks ago on the program, and he had to admit, yes, it's true. Because in fact, the joke is only funny if you know who you're joking about, if you have the background information. So it's okay to watch Colbert, it's okay to watch Jon Stewart. We do it too when we can stay up late enough. We watch it online, okay? So, but the point being that you also have to have, especially if you want to be a journalist, the real information, the filtered information, the curated information, so you know what you're getting is real. Now.
Well, on one comment about Jon Stewart and Colbert, I mean, I was in school studying English literature, and irony and satire are great forms of literary criticism. Look at Jonathan Swift. And Colbert and Stewart, I think, are brilliant. And so I stay up late because I can't wait to. It's a big argument as to staying up till midnight every night, but especially when you have to get up and do Morning Joe or something like that. But no, I think they are brilliant. But as Gwen pointed out, that was a great appearance that Gwen and Judy were on Colbert together. And as Gwen pointed out, you have to understand the joke to know how stupidly we are all covering things, and to be caught up in that. Look, I was one of those who was, and have written about this in my book, I was one of those who did not get Iraq right. I was raised as a journalist to be challenging, but also to take certain things depending on the source, and in this case the source was, I knew Colin Powell, and I knew that he had supposedly scrubbed what had been given to him by people at the agency and had been pushing back aggressively against what he was getting from Dick Cheney and from the National Security Council. So when he made his presentation on February 5th, 2003 to the Security Council, I reported it, and I don't think I was as skeptical as I should have been about the so-called evidence. And that is something that has informed and reformed a lot of the way that I now cover the NSA revelations and Edward Snowden and a lot of other things that I do. And you are absolutely correct about the death toll in Syria and the fact that we have a very short attention span and we have not been as rigorous as we should be.
Tom, are we spending more time paying attention to chemical weapons instead of the Civil War?
I don't quite understand the Syria part of the question. I didn't quite catch that. That our credibility is on the line there because why?
Because you're focusing on the chemical weapons story rather than the issue of how to hold Assad accountable.
I think it's
in other ways.
You know, it's a legitimate question. You know, I'm just trying to think of where to dive in. I'm in a little different position. Andrea's a reporter. I'm an opinion columnist.
I should make that point if you didn't pick it up.
So we come at it from a little different perspective, you know. And see, embedded in your question is an opinion that the right position is that Assad should go. I'm not saying the right position is Assad should stay. I think he's a war criminal. You know what I mean? So, but Syria is such a complicated story today. In terms of, you know, how you end this mess, that I really don't think you could hold the press accountable. Also, who is the press here? I mean, I read Middle Eastern press when I want to know what's going on in Syria, and they tell me a lot of things. One of the things that I really recoil against when people say the media, because especially today, you know, there's some amazing Middle East bloggers you can find to go to. So if you're talking about us old fogies.
Speak for yourself.
You know, exactly. That's right. Well, I walked into that one. I mean, I'll just tell you, you know, I was in Beirut in the summer of 1982, covering the Israeli invasion, which that year was the biggest story in the world. And when I looked around the Commodore Hotel, which was the sort of press central hotel in Beirut, here's who I saw. I saw ABC, NBC, CBS, Canadian television, BBC, French TV, and CNN. I saw Time, Newsweek, US News, and World Report. I saw AP, UPI, DPA, German Press Agency, AFP, Reuters, Spanish News Agency. I saw reporters, foreign correspondents from the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Baltimore Sun, the Dallas Morning News, the Miami Herald, the Los Angeles Times, the Chicago Tribune, and lots of visitors from, like, even my hometown paper, the Minneapolis Star and Tribune. I was in Beirut last year. I looked around the lobby of the Commodore Hotel, and I saw my reflection in the mirror. So all of those people had foreign correspondents, and today, not a single one does.
And let me just add, parenthetically, that the death toll for correspondents, Western correspondents in Syria has been horrendous, the kidnappings as well. And Syria has been a very, very difficult terrain for especially American correspondents to cover.
I think there's a questioner right here.
Okay. Hi, I'm Marissa Horn from the University of Maryland. I'm a sophomore in journalism
You're going to have to speak up a little bit.
Oh, okay. All right. I have a question that has to deal with NSA and Edward Snowden. Given the recent case of Edward Snowden, do you as journalists see yourself as imperative figures needed to translate information for the general public, or do you believe that WikiLeaks and similar sources will remove journalists as the middleman between the public and whistleblowers?
Did you hear that?
Not entirely. Is the question whether they are legitimate, Snowden, WikiLeaks, legitimate journalists or whistleblowers? Or I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, it was hard to pick
There's
up.
a lot of echo. I apologize.
Sorry. It's more about like whether journalists are needed anymore, because people can get their information from WikiLeaks if they really want.
The question she's asking is if people can get information from Edward Snowden, why do you need journalists anymore?
Well, if you take WikiLeaks just by example, there were, I believe, tens of thousands, maybe millions of pages that were put out. We at the New York Times assigned a whole team to sift through them and find what we thought were the most newsworthy nuggets. If we just let general readers, if we just dumped out tens of thousands of documents on people, how many would sift through them without reporters who knew the context, why this statement from an ambassador in private to a foreign minister was actually newsworthy? You have to know the context for all of these things. And just dumping out information
I dare say everything you've read about Edward Snowden has been written by a journalist who was that filter. You haven't seen the unexpurgated documents. Do you have anything to say?
And in fact, it's almost more important, given Snowden's narrow view, the narrow casting, if you will, of what he has. He has documents that are at times very, very significant, but they need to be put in context. They need to be road tested. And that's what journalists do. That's what the journalists at the New York Times, at the Guardian, and at the Washington Post have been doing primarily.
Yes.
My question is actually very related to the previous question. This administration has been prosecuting leakers and whistleblowers using the Espionage Act. And as a lover of the First Amendment, that terrifies me. And I wondered if you guys are concerned about that. And if so, what, is there something going on defensively in the newsrooms that you can do to counter that? And if so, what?
There's the Reporters Committee, which has lawyers and has worked on this. All of our news organizations have joined together in testifying in favor of shield laws. We have protested the, we think, excessively aggressive actions of the Justice Department. So there has been a lot of engagement, not entirely successful, and particularly about the lack of prior notice with what happened with the Associated Press and with Fox News, I guess.
Yeah, I would agree.
Okay. Hi.
Hi, my name is Said Zafar Hashemi, DC-based journalist originally from Afghanistan. Thank you, the three of you and the organizers of the event, for such an eye-opening and refreshing way of looking to America's foreign policy. One item that I do notice missing from America's media, as well as the panel here, is Afghanistan. It's a story kind of forgotten from the discussions. And the country is going through a very, very critical time of what has happened over the last decade. Next year, Afghans going to the polling stations to elect their next president, and Karzai going away. And right now, there is an ugly discussion going between Washington and Kabul over the bilateral security agreement, which will determine America's future military presence in Afghanistan. So I think those are the litmus tests for America, Afghans, the amount of money and resources and the blood that they spent over the last decade.
Okay. You're giving a speech now. We'd like to turn it into a question. Is that okay?
Sure. My question is Afghanistan still relevant? And if yes, why we're not talking about it?
Okay. We ran out of time is the reason. We talked for half an hour. We wanted to hear from you, and I knew that you would be here to ask the question, so.
No, but you ask a very, very important question. We have, as Tom said, upwards of 100,000 men and women still in the field, and we have invested, thousands of lives have been lost, and thousands more grievously injured of Americans. We care about Afghanistan. We had decided that it was central to our foreign policy, and yet this is our longest war, and we are about to withdraw without the status of forces agreement, as you point out, unless this is negotiated in the next few months, and with a very prickly relationship with the Karzai, the outgoing Karzai government. You have some 26 or more candidates, and an uncertain election process. There is a lot of concern among people I know, among the women who have become business leaders and political leaders and educators, as to whether the next regime will continue the Constitution, which guarantees women's rights and women's participation in the Parliament. So there is a lot of concern about what is going to happen after we withdraw. But I think what you're seeing from this administration is mirroring the weariness of the Middle East, a weariness with this war. And I agree that I don't think it's a given that there's going to be a continuing American presence in a major way, partly because of the sequester and the Pentagon cutbacks as well, and the enormous amount of American investment in Afghanistan that can't continue at this pace. Tom?
Yeah, I would just say that, you know, I certainly sympathize anyone from Afghanistan wanting to see more attention paid to it, and God bless you for asking that and for doing it. Let me just try to put it in a larger context of what's going on here that affects the news business. And this is not by way of an excuse. We have a big commitment there. We should be covering it. My newspaper covers it. But it's a very expensive proposition. We have a whole security, not going to go into detail, operation around each one of our reporters there now. It's extremely dangerous. And thank God the New York Times is there and ready to make that commitment. But it's hard for other news organizations to pay the kind of security cover you now need to cover a conflict like that. But to put it in a larger context, I think we've just sort of ended a 50-year period in America where to be a president, a mayor, a governor, or a college president was, on balance, to give things away to people. That's what you did. I think we're beginning a period, we're already into it, where to be a mayor, a governor, a college president, or a president, on balance, will be to take things away from people. And that accounts for an enormous amount of I think, the scratchiness in our politics now. And as Andrea said, part of that's going to be taking things away from the military. We're now living in an America that I'm 60, that we didn't grow up in. We're living in an America of a shrinking pie, or at least shrinking slices for people who are in the middle class. And that really affects people's focus and appetite for the concerns and aspirations of anyone outside of the United States. I personally think, you know, the biggest, I gave a talk last week at the British Museum in London, and it was for their annual dinner, and I began it. The conceit was that Neil McGregor, the director of the museum, had given me a room to illustrate the early 21st century in the museum. And I said, Neil, my room will be the most popular room in the museum because my room will be about what I think is the biggest question going on in almost every country I go to today. And the room is going to be called, How's My Kid Going to Get a Job? And I think we're really consumed with that. I just came here, before I came here, I was meeting with Israel's Minister of Economy, Naftali Bennett. And he actually came, we were going to talk about Iran. We ended up talking all about this, you know, and the concern he has for what's happening to the shrinking middle class in Israel. So all of this is background noise to what we cover, how we cover, and how much attention we give to any country. But thanks for your question.
Quick question, if I may.
Thank you.
Yes.
I think you're next.
Okay.
So,
did America's changing role in the world start with President Obama? And is the press coverage and the Republican Party criticism colored by the elephant in the room of the president's race, and is it centered in the Middle East?
It's a really good question. Next question over here, please.
You know,
Can't hear you. Yeah. Go ahead.
I would say that
question.
this is not the first president who has had difficulties in foreign policy. I, for one, believe that race has infected our domestic politics much more than discussions of foreign policy. I don't think, I mean, if you look at President Obama in 2009, from the Nobel Prize to the way he was greeted at the G20, he was welcomed in Europe in particular as the antidote to George W. Bush, whom they blamed as being too militaristic. So he started out with a huge international, a global celebration of him that at least seemed to not focus on race. I think the Tea Party and the opposition to health care and a lot of the domestic politics has in some cases had a strong racial component. So I see it more in domestic politics than I do in foreign policy.
Well, and I would also add that this is the United States in 2013. Race always has something to do with everything. But I would also caution you that it is possible to disagree with the president on policy reasons. It's possible to be against taxes. It's possible to think that government health care is a bad idea. It's possible to think that all of these things are true, which are part of the Obama doctrine policy, and it not have to do with his race. And so it is. So we've got to be careful not to assume that every time the president has a bad day, oh, well, you know, it's because he's black. That's just not always the case, even though for some people it always will be.
And just to speak to the current policies, the debacle, their words, that was Kathleen Sebelius's word, of the healthcare rollout has nothing to do with race. The criticism of that, maybe people are piling on, but the criticism of that has to do with the fact that it was done badly.
Well, we could debate that.
Okay.
Well, I do think there's an element of the objection to the health care plan which has to do with who they think is benefiting. And that you can unpack that a lot of different ways, but that's not what we're here to talk about tonight. Thank you. Yes.
Hi, Mr. Friedman. I'm Sharmishta. I'm a sophomore at the Elliott School, and I'm Singaporean. I just must say that your article received a lot of praise from fellow Singaporeans, as well as the ambassador himself last week.
Bless your heart.
I asked him the same question I'm about to ask you, and in your article you said, Singapore is not a full-fledged democracy. What it does have is a government that wakes up each day asking, what world are we living in, and how do we best use the resources we have to enable more of our citizens to thrive in this world? And I want to ask you the same thing. As an international student, I see media as a resource in America. And how would you see America using the media in the future in terms of economic growth? Thank you.
It's an interesting question. I mean, it's, you know, because it's hard for, in a country like, we don't use our media for anything because there's no one in charge, you know, of kind of pressing that button. But I think that relating it to the Singapore column is that when I was in Singapore a couple of years ago, someone from the central bank there said something that really stuck in my mind. He said, you know, we in Singapore live in a thatched hut with no doors and no windows. We feel every change of temperature immediately. We can detect every change in the direction of the wind. You Americans, you seem to live in a brick house with no doors and no windows because you know, you don't seem to be responding to anything. And I think the media's role, and it's hugely important, is to be that voice telling people what world we're living in. I happen to believe we're living, and everything I write is infused by this, through a huge technological inflection. I think we're living through a Gutenberg scale technological change. The wiring and plumbing of the world fundamentally changed in the last 10 years. When I wrote The World is Flat, Facebook didn't exist. Okay, something really big has happened in the world, but it's been disguised by the subprime crisis and post 9/11. But it's changing everyone's job, every institution, and every business, and we're all reacting to it. But there hasn't been, in my opinion, enough attention on it. I'm having a field day with it. Okay, you know, someone was alive when Gutenberg invented the printing press, and some monk said to some priest, "Now that is really cool." Okay, all right. I'm going to get away from all this longhand writing every book, and you're just going to be stamping them out. Well, I think we're actually going through a Gutenberg scale inflection point in terms of how information and knowledge are generated, collaborated on, disseminated, and turned into goods and services. And we're all feeling it. We're all feeling it. But no one's been explaining it to people, and I think it's a big part of the anxiety. Because the net effect of it, and this has been a theme of what I've been writing for the last few years, and as a chapter in my last book, is that average is officially over. Average is over. Every boss today has cheaper, easier, faster access to more above-average automation, above-average software, above-average robotics, above-average cheap labor, and above-average, oh my God, cheap genius. And how we respond to that as a society, we're seeing that now in the stress on the middle class, because when I grew up, for the 50 years after the Cold War, living in a world of walls, there was something called the middle-skilled, high-wage job. Our whole middle class for 50 years was built on the middle-skilled, high-wage job. There is no such thing in a world of webs as a middle-skilled, high-wage job. There's only a high-skilled, high-wage job. And we are now absorbing that reality and the impact it's having on the middle class. I think it's the biggest story in the world. Again, my shorthand for it is, how's my kid going to get a job? But we haven't really talked to people about it. In fact, we actually just do the opposite. Our politicians, and we as journalists should hold them accountable for this, give us nostrums. If you just work hard and play by the rules, you should be in the middle class. Well, good luck with that, okay? That was true when Bill Clinton said it at the 1992 convention. Today, you need to work harder, you need to work smarter, you need to rewrite the rules, relearn, retool more often, and then you'll be in the middle class. And because no politician wants to deliver that message, we're not talking about it. So the market is doing it for them.
Andrea and I just had a little chill when he talked about working hard and playing by the rules in Bill Clinton in 1992.
We were on the bus trips across every part of America. We covered that whole campaign together. We heard that speech
a lot. We have time for 2 more brief questions, and then we're going to have to wrap it up. Starting with you, and then you, sir.
First of all, I do want to thank you guys for joining us. It really is such an honor.
Thanks.
So through your career, you have been able to see a massive change in global polarity. And the topic of the demise of America, or our fall relative to BRICS nations, or someone else possibly, is a very hot topic. And so if you do believe that America has kind of hit its climax or hit its apex, do you believe that we are moving into a bipolar system or a multipolar system, and why? And what would those repercussions be?
Boy, you know how to ask a nice, really quick question, don't you? That is the answer I worry about. Who wants to take that?
Well, I've written about that. I'll take a stab at it. I still believe we have the greatest system of government in the world, and I think it's far superior to China's, for instance, if we speak about decline and relative decline. But I think China's getting 90% out of a bad system, and we're getting about 50% out of a good system. That's where we are right now. So how long do we remain a great country when we cannot do big, hard things together anymore? When every solution we come up with for every big problem is suboptimal. And so, I've always said, if you want to be an optimist about America today, stand on your head. Because the country looks so much better from the bottom up than from the top down. The country is actually still exploding with innovation. But if I were to draw a picture of America today, it'd be a picture of the space shuttle taking off. You've seen that. All this thrust coming from below. That's the natural innovation, explosion, I think, going on still all over the country. But in our case, the booster rocket, Washington, D.C., is cracked and leaking energy. And the pilots in the cockpit are fighting over the flight plan. So we can't achieve escape velocity right now to get into the 21st century with all our people the way we need to.
Nobody does a metaphor like Tom Friedman. Final question.
Sure. I'm going to try to amend this for you. My name's Evan. I'm from Chevy Chase, Maryland, and as of today, actually, I'm a junior at the University of Texas.
Hook 'em horns.
That's right. Backwards, though.
Backwards, sorry.
Well, you had it backwards. I think the term citizen journalist is the stupidest thing that my generation has ever come up with. Thank you.
I'm not going to clap till you explain what you mean.
Well, it's hard to explain what the term is, which is one of the reasons why it's stupid. But a lot of people have sort of hinted at what I wanted to ask. And your job as the mainstream media, all the more important now, is all the harder. Because while you were storyboarding your idea for an opinion, Edward Snowden, who no one had ever heard of before, released hundreds of thousands of documents airing out this country's dirty laundry. And the difference between you and Edward Snowden is I respect you. And so, but I can tell you that a lot of people don't use the mainstream media. So your job is all the harder now. And like you said, we're sleeping through the nation's, next great energy revolution, whatever it is. How are you?
Your question.
Sure. How are you, as the mainstream, when your job is harder now, going to inform people when it's all the more important?
Well, the previous questioner touched on, and Tom's answer touched on one of the main challenges that I face. I love what I do. I've covered the White House, I've covered Congress, I've covered the State Department. I have the best job in the world. I get up and I'm excited about the adventure of the day that's going to unfold.
I have the best job in the world, actually. But
he may be right.
They have the best jobs in the world.
But I have never seen our political system as dysfunctional as it is now. And this is corroding confidence in so many ways. And I'm very distressed as a citizen and as a journalist, not a citizen journalist, but as both, by that. And that is what makes the job so complicated right now, because who are the leaders that we can see coming together and compromising? I mean, when there's no budget, when there's no appropriations process, when there are no conference committees, when the basic legislative process, when we have confirmations of appeals court justices thrown out again yesterday, time after time, having nothing to do with the merits of the nominee, nothing to do with ideology, just with party labels, and just with an effort to punish the inhabitant of the White House by the minority party in the Senate. And you see just a complete dysfunction in government. That's what is my main concern. I covered Congress, and it was probably the greatest beat. And there was a lot of scandal in those years, and we saw a Speaker of the House in the well of the House kicked out, and all sorts of things going on, and changes in party dominance, decades of party dominance. But we've never seen anything, I think, in the modern era at least, quite like this. And that goes for impeachment. There has been nothing that has brought this government to its knees the way the fiscal and budgetary policies and political dysfunction of the last couple of years. So that's the crisis that I see. And I don't quite know how to get my arms around it as a reporter, especially one who tries to be and there's no such thing because we all make judgments about what's important to us, but as sort of objective and straight and fair in the way I approach the news. So that's probably not answering your question, but that's really my challenge.
Yeah, what I would say, just to pick up on what Andrew said, is that, first of all, I kind of bristle at your mainstream journalists. I mean, I got more online readers than, pretty much anybody, so, I think there aren't mainstream and non-mainstream or what. I think there are good journalists and bad journalists. And there are good journalists at newspapers and traditional publications, and there are amazing journalists blogging and online, and there are bad ones in both places. And to me, it's all driven by the quality of your journalism. If you're a great journalist on a one-person website, you're going to get attention, and if you're a bad journalist at the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal, that's going to get exposed. So, but one cannot. A story like Edward Snowden comes along, once every decade, where someone is able to penetrate something that's secret at the NSA and release so many documents. But yeah, I wrote a book about energy, 6 years ago, and I had a chapter in the book. My favorite chapter is because everyone wants to be green. Everyone wants to be Al Gore. win a Nobel Prize, win an Oscar, be the toast of the world, you know. But I had a chapter in the book, and it was called "If It Isn't Boring, It Isn't Green." And it was about how if you really want to have a big impact as a green, as someone who cares about the environment and climate, learn how a utility works. Because one of the greatest green heroes, and I profiled him in the book, was a guy who worked for NRDC, who got the government to raise the energy standards for every Coke machine in the country. You've never heard of him, but when you can do something like that, that scales, and it's really true that really great journalists I've known, they're the people who day to day, you know, get to the bottom of a story. People like my colleague Michael Gordon, Robert Pear, they can be very difficult, I can tell you. But I've worked with them, so has Gwen. But they're usually they're the last people to leave the office. It isn't as heroic, and it's not to take anything away from the Snowden or the WikiLeaks or whatever. You know, there's heroism in that too. But there's a sort of quiet heroism in these people who, you know, cover a story like healthcare.gov every day and keep us informed, and I salute them.
And you have been fortunate to share the room tonight with two of the greatest journalists working today, Tom Friedman and Andrea Mitchell.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll see you.
So thank you so much to Tom and Andrea and Gwen for giving us such an incisive, candid, and engaging discussion this evening. And thank you as well for your extremely thoughtful questions. Yeah. We hope that you'll be able to stop at our information table on the way out to give us your information or support or learn more about us. We very much appreciate your coming. Good night.